I mean to fight this war and win it.
House of the Dragon is back for season 2, and so is the official Game of Thrones podcast. I'm Jason Concepcion.
And I'm Greta Johnson. Together, we are going to be talking about every new episode of the HBO original series, House of the Dragon.
The second season starts Sunday, June 16th, but new episodes of this podcast start on May 22nd.
Listen directly on Max or wherever you get your podcasts.
Good. To war, then.
When raising a Pacifico beer with friends you just met turns into hitting up their friend's local art show, getting inspired to create something together, and painting your first mural, you found what was waiting for you. Pacifico. Life's waiting. 21 plus only. Discover responsibly. Pacifico Clara Beer. Imported by Crown Imports, Chicago, Illinois.
Hey parents, Greenlight is here to take one big thing off your to-do list, teaching your kids about money. With a Greenlight debit card and money app of their own, kids and teens learn to earn, save, and invest. You can send money instantly, set flexible controls, and get real-time notifications of your kids' money activity. Set up chores and put allowance on autopilot to reward them for their hard work. Then, learn about the world of money together. Get 1 month free when you sign up at greenlight.com/podcast.
Today's episode will touch on sensitive topics such as sexual abuse, violence, suicide, and drug overdose. So if you are sensitive to this content, please listen at your own discretion. What is art without the muse? Many of Western art's most famous works are depictions of women. But who were these women? Do they have their own stories to share with the world? Hello and welcome to ArtMuse, a podcast that aims to reshape the ways in which we interpret well-known works of art by paying dues to the women whose images have been immortalized, but whose names and stories have been wrongfully overlooked. While these women's faces are familiar to viewers around the world, their identities have been largely forgotten. Together, we will appreciate these works of art from a new perspective, through the eyes of the women whose image stares back at us. Is the muse in actuality just as, if not more important than the artists themselves? And I'm your host, Grace Anna. Welcome to part 2 of our 2-part episode on Audrey Munson. In part 1, we explored Audrey's rise to stardom. From her childhood beginnings in upstate New York, the prophecy a Romani traveler predicted of her life, her move to New York City and start as a chorus girl, her happen-chance discovery by a photographer on the street, the numerous artists she eventually modeled for, and examined some of the many monuments around New York City that feature Audrey's image. We left things off in our story just after Audrey's success at the 1915 World Fair, which turned Audrey Munson into the greatest sensation America had ever seen. Following the World Fair, Audrey began to refer to herself not as a model, but as an artist. In the 1916 and 1920 census reports, Audrey wrote that her occupation was an artist. During her free time, Audrey did practice singing, music, and dance, honing in on her natural talents. But more than this, Audrey began to emphasize that modeling in and of itself was an artistic practice and took a great amount of artistic skill. She stressed that modeling was a collaborative process with the artist and that the model's role in the creation of artworks was of utmost importance. She joined the Art Workers Club for Women, a union for female models and artists with the goal to, quote, help the models, dignify the profession of posing, and enable the artist to procure prompt and reliable service. Declaring her occupation as artist was an intentional act to shift the perception of the artist model from passive to active, and to make clear that modeling was an art form in its own right. And this artist was ready to take on Broadway. After the success of the World Fair, Audrey wished to venture beyond modeling for just artists. She was selected as the top model for a new show on Broadway called The Fashion Show. Similar to fashion shows today, the fashion show showcased the newest styles of the season and had an audience of high society members, including editors of the newly established Vogue magazine. As the star of the show, Audrey was dubbed the Spirit of Fashion and likened a goddess as she flaunted each design on stage. As author James Bone wrote, "The fashion show was her chance to reinvent herself and trade the life of an artist model for a career on the stage." What Audrey could not have known as she bowed on opening night to a standing ovation was that the fashion show would be canceled after only 1 week of runtime, and her career as a Broadway star unfairly cut short at the behest of a powerful and morally corrupt Broadway executive. Opening night should have been a night of celebration. Instead, it was one of the grimmest nights of Audrey's life and forever changed the course of her career. As Audrey was undressing in her private dressing room after the show, she noticed her door swing open. In walked one of the most powerful men in the theater world. Before Audrey could collect herself, he quickly approached Audrey, put his arms around her waist, and began kissing her shoulder. The shocked Audrey tried her hardest to wiggle free, and in her desperation began hitting him. She screamed, "Get away from me! Don't touch me! I hate you! Your touch is repulsive to me! I would rather have a snake crawl all over me than to feel your hand upon me." As the man released Audrey from his grip, he looked her dead in the eyes and muttered, "Do you mean what you have just said?" As he angrily walked out of the dressing room, he screamed back at her, "You will have cause to remember this." Still shaking, Audrey stood in shock. She knew that there would be consequences of turning away such a powerful man, a man who rarely heard the word no. Though she feared the severe repercussions, she never once regretted protecting herself. The next morning, Audrey woke up to the news that the fashion show would be canceled at the end of the week. Despite the packed crowds and obvious success, her dream of being respected for more than just her body was unfairly thrown back into her face. And just like that, Audrey's short time as a Broadway star had ended. Audrey never officially named the man who had assaulted her in the dressing room, but did imply that he was a household name known by many. It's believed that her assaulter was a man named Edward Franklin Albee, an extremely prominent figure in the theater world at the time. In a private letter that exists today, Audrey named Albee as her biggest enemy, and she eventually went on to sue Albee's theater company. Audrey claimed that the fashion show had reopened in Brooklyn with a different leading actress, but was still using Audrey's photographs and name in their promo. As the court documents read, "The plaintiff, Audrey, has been held up to ridicule and contempt, and has been greatly damaged in her business and occupation, and has suffered great anxiety of mind, humiliation, and mortification." To make things right, Audrey demanded $20,000 in damages. The lawsuit turned ugly fast. In an effort to pressure Audrey to drop the charges, Albee released nude photographs of Audrey to the press. In the end, the case was settled out of court. Though the details of the settlement unfortunately do not survive today, it can be safely assumed that Audrey was paid off to drop the charges and remained silent. The ordeal proved to be extremely detrimental to Audrey's career, and no other stage directors were willing to hire her. She had to go back to modeling for artists to make ends meet, but even her modeling gigs were a downgrade from her days of the past. Often the only job she could book required her to be cast in plaster, a suffocating process in which plaster was applied to her entire body. The casting process in many ways felt like being buried alive. She had to close her eyes and hold her breath as her entire head was encased. As Audrey once described, "Inside, the girl cannot move so much as a fraction of an inch. She is virtually part of the plaster itself. It is nothing less than a horrible sensation." Refusing to be further humiliated, Audrey decided to pick herself back up and continue to dream of a brighter future. If the theater world wouldn't have her, then it was time for a new endeavor. And so Audrey marched her way into the film industry. She starred in her first film, Inspiration, in 1915. Inspiration was loosely based off Audrey's own life. The story follows a young sculptor who is in a desperate search for the perfect model. One day, his friends happen upon a poor young woman on the street. The sculptor knows his prayers have been answered and asks the woman to model for his greatest masterpiece. Over her time posing for the sculptor, she secretly falls in love with him. And when the work is finished, she leaves a note confessing her love and disappears from the studio. The sculptor finds the note and, having fallen in love with her too, dramatically goes looking for the woman all over New York City. In the end, he finds her curled up at the base of her sculpture, and they eventually marry. For the modeling scenes, Audrey had to be cast in plaster on camera, a live enactment of the process she had begrudgingly done many times in her past. But this time, it would work to her benefit. For the scene, Audrey had to be completely in the nude, and she would go down in American history as the first woman in a leading role to ever appear nude on film. How did Audrey feel posing in the nude on camera, knowing that she was making history on screen? Was posing for a camera a more vulnerable experience? Or did the change exhilarate her? Was she ready to make a splash in the world of cinema? Luckily, Audrey's leap of faith paid off. Inspiration filled theaters to capacity nationwide, from opening to closing day. In Los Angeles alone, 40% of the city's entire population reported that they had seen the film. Newspapers called Inspiration novel and daring. Though the film racked in impressive earnings, Audrey herself was only paid $450, a tiny fraction of the box office total. The film did, however, turn Audrey Munson into a household name and launched her career as an actress. Unfortunately, no copies of Inspiration survive today. Because of Inspiration's success, it didn't take long for Audrey to book her second film. The following year, Audrey starred in Purity, a much larger production. An intentionally ironic title, there was very little pure about Purity. The film centered on two parallel plots, one following the goddess of virtue set in ancient times, and the other a contemporary love story set in New York. In the latter, the wife of a struggling poet secretly models in the nude for an artist so that she can pay for her husband's poems to be published. When her husband finds out that she had posed in the nude, he threatens to break off their marriage, but later begs for her forgiveness when he understands the sacrifice she had made for him. Audrey starred as both the goddess of virtue as well as the poet's wife. Here again, Audrey is captured on film, fully in the nude. Not only in the scenes posing naked for an artist, but even as the goddess of virtue, whose breasts were often slipping out of her Grecian robe. Because of this, the National Board of Censorship held a focus group prior to the film's release to gauge the audience's response to the film's risky nature. While the majority of the group voted that Purity should not be approved for general release, they did overwhelmingly vote in favor of its release to age-restricted audiences. In the end, the Board of Censorship left it up to individual cities to decide if they would air the film or not. Purity was banned in 10 different cities, like Kansas City and Dallas. But in the cities in which it screened, it was an even bigger success than Inspiration. On its opening day, Purity made even more money than Birth of a Nation, released the previous year. Critics called it a gasp-arouser and wrote of Audrey, "Her winning sweetness, her nobility, her superb grace and finished acting are never to be forgotten optical delights." But Purity was not without its scathing reviews as well. One in particular, published in the New York Tribune, was especially unforgiving towards Audrey. It read, "Although it is rather pretty, it is certainly very dull. As an actress, Miss Munson is quite incapable of registering an emotion." Fortunately, these less than favorable reviews did not have a lasting impact on the film's reception at large, and Audrey's stardom as an actress rose. To film Purity, Audrey and Kitty moved to Santa Barbara. The California life suited Audrey. She rented a beach bungalow and took daily swims in the sea. She drove a fashionable Hudson Super 6 automobile and enjoyed an affair with an older Hollywood director. She wore one-piece bathing suits, bravely declaring that women should be able to wear the same kind of bathing suit as men. And she let out her wild and daredevil spirit. One day, as Audrey took her daily swim outside of her bungalow, she noticed something magical ascending from the water into the sky across the beach from her. As Audrey watched a small plane soar above her, she became determined to fly with it. When Audrey learned it was her neighbor who owned the hydroplane, she approached him and begged him to take her up into the sky. At the time of this discovery, Audrey had just begun shooting her next feature film, Girl O' Dreams, which was being filmed on a small island just off of California's coast. As she imagined herself flying in the hydroplane, she began conjuring up the plan to fly to set. After familiarizing herself with the plane, Audrey was ready to take off. On the day of her flight, she wore just her signature one-piece bathing suit and a helmet. As the plane lifted off, Audrey could see below her all of California's coast. Audrey later remembered, "It was the most wonderful adventure of my life." As we will see, this happy memory would remain with Audrey for decades to come, a standout moment she would return to in her late age as she reflected upon her long life. As Audrey landed on the small island and proudly deboarded the hydroplane, she completely amazed the film's cast and crew, who had never seen such a grand entrance. Unfortunately, Audrey's stunt was about the only thing that garnered amazement surrounding the film. Girl O' Dreams, Audrey's third film, has a convoluted plot that would be considered highly problematic by today's standards. As the story went, a woman, played by Audrey, goes on a cruise with her mother. During the trip, the ship catches fire, and Audrey's character is the sole survivor of the accident. She manages to swim to a deserted island where a male artist was living in refuge. Audrey's character suffered severe memory loss from the shipwreck and adapts a childlike demeanor. The artist takes her in and she begins to model for him. Impressed by her beauty, the artist sends a picture to one of his contacts in New York, who is so enamored with Audrey's image that he comes to the island himself and attempts to rape her. As Audrey struggles to keep him off of her, she falls off of the cliff and hits her head. The injury brings back her memory, and she remembers both the shipwreck and who she was prior to it. The sculptor offers to send her back to New York to return to her life, but she decides to stay with the artist, and the two fall in love. Once again, Audrey was cast as an artist's model and appeared in the nude in several scenes. But here the similarities between Audrey and her character went well beyond the surface level. The dark parallel between her character's attempted assault and her own recent attempted assault must not have gone unnoticed to Audrey. and we can only imagine the ways in which her role bled into her own processing. And some believe that the decision to give Audrey's character brain damage and acute dementia may have been to cover up Audrey's own declining mental health, which could have begun to already show itself. Unfortunately, Girl O' Dreams was pulled before it was released in theaters, and there are no records to indicate that it was ever screened. When the film turned out to be a flop, Audrey decided it was time to head back to the East Coast. Despite the film's unsuccess, she was still greeted with open arms by New York's elite. Her rising fame over the years granted her access to the most privileged social circles, and it would be within these circles that Audrey would meet the man who would break her heart in two and trigger the beginning of her steep downfall. We have not yet delved into Audrey's romantic life, which at this point had been a series of flings turned failed relationships. In her early years, she dated a pastor's son, but broke things off when his father died of heart disease, which Audrey worried would be passed on to him. Later, she dated a railway executive who had seen Audrey's sculptures and become enamored with her. But in the end, Audrey did not love him enough to marry him. We know at one point she was engaged to a mechanical engineering student at Columbia University, but he broke off the engagement when he found nude photographs of Audrey in an art dealer's window. But by far the most significant affair Audrey was to have was with the well-to-do Herman Ulrich. By the time Audrey had become involved with Herman, he was easily considered America's richest bachelor. But his wealth did not prevent equal controversy. The year before Audrey met Herman, he was arrested for stabbing a woman when she turned down his advances. Though she survived, Herman was charged with a felony for assault. The ordeal does not paint a pretty picture of Herman, who clearly had a propensity towards violent and erratic behavior. We do not know the exact circumstances of how Herman met Audrey, but it is no surprise that Herman would have been attracted to her, given that she was known nationwide for her exceptional beauty. And for Audrey, Herman would have given her direct access to the most prestigious families within the elite, and an impressive name to attach herself to. Though we're certain that Audrey and Herman were romantically involved, there's some discrepancy over the seriousness of their relationship. In fact, Audrey's mother, Kitty, insisted that Audrey and Herman secretly married in 1917. She even listed on both the 1930 and 1940 census that she was the mother of Audrey M. Ulrich, but there are no other surviving records that would support this claim. Most likely, Kitty clung to the opportunity to attach her and Audrey's name to such a prestigious family and stake her claim in their fortune, and it's unlikely that the two officially married. Whether Audrey and Herman tied the knot or not, their relationship was far from picturesque, and Audrey was severely unhappy. In a letter from 1921, Audrey blamed Herman for the deterioration of their relationship, claiming that he had an affair with another woman. What Audrey may have not known at the time was that Herman actually seemed to have been queer. There are surviving letters that Herman wrote to his closest confidants that describe a heated affair with a male Russian ballet dancer. All in all, it's obvious that Herman did not harbor the romantic feelings towards Audrey that she would have wished for, and the relationship left Audrey in complete and utter heartbreak. After her breakup with Herman Ulrich, Audrey recoiled into relative obscurity. By 1918, Audrey almost completely disappeared from newspapers. Audrey and Kitty had to move from their fancy home in Riverdale to a boarding house in Lincoln Square. In 1919, Audrey caught the rampant Spanish flu and took several months to fully recover. Audrey's once comfortable bank accounts were running dry, and she began to feel used and abused by the artists who gravely underpaid her as they used her image to create masterpieces, by the movie producers who raked in record-breaking ticket sales but paid Audrey a minuscule fraction of the earnings, by the theater powerhouse who ruined Audrey's stage career with the snap of his fingers, and by Herman Ulrich, who clearly harbored no real feelings for Audrey. Audrey's mental health began to suffer. Her moods were erratic and hard to control. She grew increasingly paranoid that the world was out to get her, at times grasping at convoluted conspiracies she had developed in her own mind. In 1919, Audrey became so consumed with these thoughts that she wrote a 3-page letter to the U.S. State Department outlining her enemies and how they had wronged her. In the letter, Audrey listed a long list of wrongdoers, including Herman Ulrich, Edward Albee, the theater executive who destroyed Audrey's stage career, journalists, and ex-lovers. She claimed that many of these enemies were German sympathizers, and much of the letter includes derogatory language surrounding Jews. She accused some of these men of taking private photographs of her and secretly sending them to Germans, and stealing her birth certificate. She ends the letter with, "It's about time you surveyed some of these motion picture houses and investigated this German crowd in the movie picture business." Though Audrey had valid reason to be upset over the years that her craft and image had been taken advantage of, her letter read as explosive, dramatic, anti-Semitic, and most importantly, not grounded in any substantial facts. When the State Department received her letter, its acting chief responded, "The letter is involved and illiterate, and is rather difficult to see what she is driving at." Despite Audrey's tirade being largely nonsensical, and the State Department's rejection of her claims, it's clear that Audrey was incredibly wounded, and that her mental health had declined to a concerning low. And unfortunately, this downward trend would only continue. On February 27, 1919, an event would take place miles away from Audrey and without her knowledge that would forever change the course of her life and send her already compromised mental health to a dark place of no return. On this evening, a man named Dr. Wilkins returned to his home in Long Beach with his wife after a night out in Manhattan. When they arrived at home, Dr. Wilkins attacked his wife with a hammer and hit her a staggering 16 times in the head. Dr. Wilkins called the police, and when they arrived, he attempted to cover up the murder by claiming intruders had come and murdered his wife. But it didn't take long for his cover-up to be exposed, and Dr. Wilkins to be charged with first-degree murder. The case sent shockwaves nationwide. Those who knew Dr. Wilkins could hardly fathom what would make such an established doctor and dignified gentleman commit such a brutal act. But a motive began to surface, and it involved another woman, Audrey Munson. Dr. Wilkins and his wife owned the boarding house in Lincoln Square that Audrey and Kitty resided at after Audrey's fallout with Herman Ulrich. Dr. Wilkins was Audrey's landlord, and because he was also a doctor, he treated Audrey when she contracted the Spanish flu. Audrey was living in the boarding house up until just a few weeks before the murder, and people began to speculate that Dr. Wilkins murdered his wife so that he could have a chance at being with Audrey. It was deemed a bloody act of lust, and though Audrey was nowhere near the scene of the crime, she had found her way into the heart of the biggest murder case of her day. To make matters worse, at the height of the hubbub surrounding the murder trial, Audrey Munson was nowhere to be found, which only propelled suspicions that she had somehow been involved. On March 25, 1919, a nationwide manhunt was conducted, with newspapers all over the country asking for Audrey to step forward to be questioned by the police. As it turned out, Audrey had left a few weeks prior for Toronto to discuss a new movie deal, and had planned to go to England from there to visit distant family. Audrey was not only in another country and impossible to reach, but clueless to the fact that her name was printed on the front page of every newspaper in America. Audrey's father contacted the press and released the statement, "Audrey is not hiding or running away from any district attorney. It is perfectly preposterous to suggest that she ran away. It is no secret that Audrey had been in Toronto and was there 3 weeks ago when I heard from her last." When authorities in Toronto finally got a hold of Audrey, she was utterly shocked. Not only that Dr. Wilkins had murdered his wife, but that she could have been the reason for such a gruesome act. We get a sense of Audrey's own perspective from a surviving letter that Audrey wrote to the Nassau County DA. In Audrey's own words, "I have been much annoyed by statements in the newspapers that you were looking for me as a witness in the Wilkins murder trial. The Toronto authorities recently told me I was wanted in Mineola because it was believed I could tell them something of the private life of Dr. Wilkins, who I knew as a refined, cultured old gentleman. I resent the statements attributed to you that I left the Wilkins home in New York on account of remarks the doctor is supposed to have made about me. I told Mrs. Wilkins in early December that Mother and I intended to go to England, where I have numerous relatives that we have not been able to see for several years. And let me say right here that I'm not going to be cajoled into coming to Mineola to testify against Dr. Wilkins, because Mother and I believe him to be innocent of any crime, as we know him to be a gentleman, incapable of such an offense as charged against him. The relations between Dr. and Mrs. Wilkins were ideal, and during the time Mother and I lived with them, we never knew them to have a fight. In March, we read of the murder and was astonished to learn that I was being hunted by the district attorney of Nassau County. There was never anything wrong with Dr. Wilkins and myself. On several occasions, he acted as my medical advisor. Yours truly, Audrey Munson." From his jail cell, Dr. Wilkins echoed Audrey's sentiments and insisted that he had only had a distant acquaintance with Audrey. He not only never implied that his love for Audrey motivated the murder, but he maintained his innocence at large. Though Audrey did not attend the trial, she remained a huge part of the case, and her name was on everyone's lips. In the end, the jury found Dr. Wilkins guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to death by an electric chair. The day before Dr. Wilkins' execution, he hung himself from a rope in his cell, taking his own life. He left a note that read, "I prefer to be my own executioner. I am absolutely innocent of this crime." Audrey made no public comment on Dr. Wilkins' suicide. How did Audrey feel as she learned of Dr. Wilkins' fate? Did she feel sorrow over his dark end, or guilt that she could have in any way been a part of his decision to kill his wife? Did she believe in his innocence? Or did she deep down know that Dr. Wilkins' conviction was right, and that he had murdered his wife? Was she resentful that the ordeal damaged her already compromised reputation? We'll continue our story after a brief word from our advertisers.
When raising a Pacifico beer with friends you just met turns into hitting up their friend's local art show, getting inspired to create something together, and painting your first mural, you found what was waiting for you. Pacifico. Life's waiting. 21 plus only. Discover responsibly. Pacifico Clara Beer. Imported by Crown Imports, Chicago, Illinois.
Hey parents, Greenlight is here to take one big thing off your to-do list, teaching your kids about money. With a Greenlight debit card and money app of their own, kids and teens learn to earn, save, and invest. You can send money instantly, set flexible controls, and get real-time notifications of your kids' money activity. Set up chores and put allowance on autopilot to reward them for their hard work. Then learn about the world of money together. Get 1 month free when you sign up at greenlight.com/podcast.
Welcome back, listeners. Now let's dive back in. Things took a dark turn for Audrey after the Wilkins case. Because her name was so intertwined with the case, people started to give Audrey the cold shoulder. Upon her return to New York, the high society circles she was once welcomed into stopped communicating with her. Even the artists that she had once worked for were hesitant to involve themselves with her in any capacity and sent her away from their studios. Film directors released her from any remaining contracts. As Audrey later recalled, "Wherever I went, I felt cold, curious eyes upon me. I suppose that the whole wretched business had shattered my nerves. But you have no idea the hell on earth I have endured. I suppose some people think that to be mixed up in a famous murder case would be good advertising for a movie star, but they are making a great mistake. You see, the circumstances surrounding the crime were so perfectly hideous. An old woman, beaten to death with a piece of lead pipe. Her husband, convicted of murder and hanging himself in his cell. And an artist model and screen star, tacitly, if not actually, alleged to have been the vampire on whose account the horrible deed was committed. First the elite, then the artists, then the movie stars, and finally the public had all turned their backs on Audrey Munson. As the Washington Post wrote of Audrey's situation, it surely seemed as if fate, wielding a mighty hammer, had brought down upon this model a blow that shattered. Audrey became increasingly paranoid that the Romani woman's premonition that Audrey's happiness and success would turn to ash in her mouth was coming true before her eyes. A complete outcast in New York, Audrey headed to the Midwest, where she was hired by Fox Studios to make appearances at theaters, posing alongside screenings of her film Purity. Despite the success of these events, in some cases eager visitors waiting in long lines to see her at the screenings, Audrey was paid excruciatingly small amounts. Her finances were so dire that she actually became stranded in Detroit, unable to afford a ticket home. She ended up having to pawn her jewelry and offering dance classes to children to pay for her ticket back to New York. Upon returning, Audrey met Kitty in Syracuse, where she had moved during Audrey's absence. Kitty took a job as a kitchen utensil saleswoman to make ends meet. Audrey and Kitty had to share a single furnished room. In their desperation, Audrey applied to be an apprentice at the Syracuse Public Library. The pay was only 15 cents an hour, but her application was immediately rejected. She made the rounds to several different department stores, applying to work as a saleswoman, but every single one rejected her. As Audrey later described, "The excuses they give are worse than if they would come out flatly and say that they do not wish their customers to approach such a woman as Audrey Munson." In total, she applied to over 200 jobs, but none would have her. The severe downgrade in lifestyle and rejection after rejection understandably caused Audrey immense emotional distress. As a reporter for the New York World wrote, "The gloriously beautiful Audrey Munson is now a girl who shrinks if you look at her, who speaks in a low, hesitating voice as though she were not certain you would think what she had to say worth hearing, who is thin, almost to emaciation. The hollows in her cheeks and in her throat are visible evidences of the material hardships she has endured and is enduring." Audrey's situation was so grim that she even tried to fake her own death in hopes of a fresh start. A year after the Wilkins murder debacle, Audrey dressed up as an old woman with a hunched back, exaggerating her posture as she walked into a police station in Syracuse. Upon entering, she announced that she heard Audrey Munson had died. Sadly, Audrey's plan did not go as planned, and the police clerk recognized Audrey immediately. She ran out of the office sobbing, desperately throwing herself into Kitty's arms. Audrey had hit the lowest of the lows, and she needed a miracle to pull herself out of it. And against all odds, Audrey's prayers were answered. In September of 1920, Audrey was presented with the offer to make an autobiographical film about her life. The film was meant to be a cautionary tale about the dangers of posing nude for the sake of art. And though it had a slightly derogatory tone, Audrey was in too desperate a situation to turn it down. Audrey excitedly packed her bags and boarded a train to New York City. She brought with her her two half-sisters from her father's second marriage. As they went sightseeing around the city, they couldn't believe how many monuments included Audrey's image. In the Metropolitan Museum alone, they counted that Audrey could be found in 40 separate works. Upon her arrival, Audrey notified newspapers that a movie was about to be made about her life. As one journal wrote, Audrey Munson is again on her way to fame and fortune. When she left here a few weeks ago, she was pale and emaciated. She is now her former self. In one newspaper, they even printed a copy of the check in the amount of $27,500 offered to Audrey Munson for the rights to her story. A contract was signed between Audrey and Perry Play Films, with a $2,000 signing fee. To grow momentum around the film, a 20-part series titled The Queen of the Artist Studio was published in the Sunday edition of New York American, with each part released over 20 consecutive weeks. Throughout the series, Audrey revealed some of her most intimate experiences and secrets over her many years as a model. As the newspaper wrote, Audrey Munson has written the story of her life, the incidences and episodes behind the scenes in the studios, the unknown history of the inspiration of many masterpieces in public and private art collections, the strange eccentricities and methods of the artists, and the distressing tragedies of the pretty models who lacked the moral balance to safeguard them from the perils of the intimate atmosphere of the studios. With the help of a ghostwriter, Audrey told personal tales and anecdotes, from tidbits on other models, the jealous wives of different artists, embarrassing incidents, and her various inner thoughts while modeling for some of the biggest artists of her day. The newspaper series was a massive hit, and Audrey was able to regain her reputation with the public. Every Sunday morning, thousands of eager readers enjoyed a new story from Audrey's life, and Audrey was in the driver's seat, in full control of how her image was being portrayed, for perhaps the first and only time in her life. The series was meant to draw attention to the upcoming film Heedless Moths, which was loosely based on Audrey's life, with some added fictional storylines, like a love triangle between Audrey, an artist, and his wife. As the story goes, the character of Audrey Munson is discovered by a sculptor in Greenwich Village and begins to model for him in the nude. The sculptor's wife grows suspicious of Audrey and, in an act of vengeance, starts an affair with the painter. When the sculptor finds the painter in his studio, Audrey pretends it was her having the affair with him to save the sculptor and his wife's marriage. In the end, the selfless Audrey is able to mend their marriage and play the hero. Heedless Moths debuted in 1921. Unfortunately, the reception to Heedless Moths was far from positive. It received scathing reviews, calling it indecent and tiresome. One of the biggest issues viewers took with the film was that Audrey's character was not actually played by Audrey Munson herself. It came out that producers had used a double to act in the majority of the film, leaving audiences feeling snubbed. This decision was likely made because Audrey herself was not in a well enough state to adequately act in her own film, still reeling from the waves of depression and mental exhaustion. What was meant to be Audrey's big comeback was instead a big bust. The film not only left a sour taste in the audience's mouth, but Audrey's as well. Audrey ended up suing the film's producer, Alan Rock, for $15,000, claiming that not only did she not receive her $2,000 signing fee, but also most of her weekly payments. Audrey claimed the check for $27,500 that had been printed in newspapers was forged. The film's production staff argued that Audrey was paid for her work, which was limited when she proved unfit to star in the role herself. Unfortunately, Audrey had to drop the case due to her inability to afford legal representation. Once again, Audrey was taken advantage of and broke because of it. The ordeal took a massive hit to not only Audrey's confidence, but her mental well-being. Her depression and anxiety were exasperated, and she reached a point of near psychological break. To make money, Audrey once again toured the Midwest. She was hired to pose next to a screening of Purity, but this time, at the very end, as she dropped her drapery and revealed her nude figure, police stormed the theater and arrested Audrey for, quote, conspiracy to commit acts injurious to public morals. Though the charges were dropped, whatever remained of Audrey's willpower was shattered. In one last-ditch effort to remain in the public eye and settle into a happy life, Audrey set on a public quest to find the perfect partner. Audrey had become exhausted by not only her continued failed professional endeavors, but also her romantic ones. Now 30 and living back in a single-room apartment with her mother, Kitty, Audrey was ready to find a husband who could sweep her off her feet and save her from her desperate situation. Soon, Audrey's quest for love was all that the papers would write about. Headlines like, "The perfect model's quest for the perfect man," were on every cover page. Audrey shared her specific qualifications, mainly that her counterpart should lack any physical imperfections and have equal intellect and charm. Letters began pouring in from all over the country, with over 1,000 different applicants from men from all walks of life, cowboys, assistants, and even convicts. As Audrey joked at the time, "I never realized that there were so many men in the world who considered themselves the ideal of physical beauty." After scrutinizing countless contestants, Audrey narrowed it down to 5 finalists: 1 a world's traveler, 1 a cowboy, 1 a widower, 1 a businessman, and 1 a French skier. But in the end, none of these men would be the winner. In April of 1922, Audrey put a stop on her public search for the perfect husband, claiming that she had finally found true love. The lucky man was Joseph Stevenson, an aviator who had fought in World War I and was working as an architectural contractor in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Though he may not have been without physical imperfections, as Audrey stated, "I do know that he is perfect as the eyes of the heart see him. That is enough for me. That perfect man? Why think of him now that the real man has come along?" Audrey and Joseph soon became engaged and made plans for a big wedding. Audrey was elated to be able to turn a new leaf and to have the happy ending she knew she deserved. Audrey declared, "I shall never return to either the movies or the studio. I am through with that life forever. The only field of art that I would ever attempt again is concert playing, and that only under certain conditions. Right now, I feel that if I can only perform the role of a dutiful wife, life will be richer by far than all the laurels of a successful career in art." But as the Romani woman once predicted, never shall Audrey wed. On Saturday, May 27, 1922, Audrey received a telegram at her home in upstate New York. Upon reading the telegram, Audrey screamed in despair, "This will end my misery!" Though Audrey never revealed what the telegram said, nor who it was from, it's assumed that she received the news that Joseph Stevenson had married somebody else. Devastated at the collapse of her career as an art model, performer, and film actress, and now also her future marriage, Audrey must have felt that she had little to live for. As she dropped the telegram in shock, she ran to her room and ingested 4 tablets of mercury bichloride. Kitty frantically ran out of the house screaming for help, and neighbors tried to force Audrey to eat egg whites to absorb the poison. As Audrey protested, she screamed that she would use her handgun to finish the job if the pills didn't work, which Kitty quickly grabbed from Audrey's hands. Audrey was rushed to the hospital, where doctors described her condition as critical. Initially, it seemed unlikely that Audrey would survive. Luckily, after further assessment and treatment, doctors could confidently say that Audrey would make a full recovery. When the press learned of Audrey's suicide attempt, they interviewed Audrey's neighbors and close associates. As the Syracuse Journal reported, neighbors say that Miss Munson seemed greatly distressed lately and had repeatedly declared plots against her had been successful. And another wrote, she was possessed by the delusion she was pursued by a curse. After Audrey recovered from the suicide attempt, she became a relative recluse, spending time with only her mom and 2 dogs. She left her house only to go to the post office, a trip she preferred to take on roller skates. She would wear a strange headscarf over her head to not draw attention to herself, but it only amplified neighbors' judgments. When Audrey passed by children on the street, they would run inside, and she became known around town as Crazy Audrey. Once describing herself as an artist in previous censuses, Audrey began to write none as her occupation next to her name. While the world around her was enjoying the excitement of the roaring 20s, with all its opulence and grandeur, Audrey had shuttered herself inside. Kitty wrote in a letter, "The poor girl feels as though the whole world has turned against her, and I don't blame her. The gang with the money has used her beauty to bring them wealth, and she got nothing from it all. But we are going to fight for our rights. I don't know what we will do. It's so hard to tell how to go after people with such wealth and power. But I, for one, am going to keep fighting until I can fight no longer." As the days dragged on, Audrey would ruminate over how she had fallen so far from the top. Her continued misfortune had sparked increasing paranoia that the prophecy read to her as a child had indeed come true, and that there were many people out to get her. She became specifically suspicious of Jews and harnessed strong anti-Semitic sentiments. Audrey began to blame Jews for her downfall. Her obsession over how Jews in particular had wronged her seems to have been further fueled by Kitty. A lawyer in Syracuse came forward saying that Audrey and Kitty had asked him to represent them, quote, against the damn Jews in New York who stole all of her money. Kitty wrote in a letter to a friend, "The Jews have cheated her out of all that belongs to her, more than $2 million. We can't get a lawyer to fight against them." Audrey's mental state was so compromised, her paranoia reaching incredulous heights, that in 1922 she even petitioned the House of Representatives to pass a bill that would, quote, protect her against prosecution by Hebrews. These views were particularly problematic given that it was a time of growing international anti-Semitism. Hitler was in the process of writing Mein Kampf, and Jews were being persecuted around the globe. Though nothing came of Audrey's incessant accusations and complaints, her derogatory statements about Jews were especially harmful in a time when anti-Semitism was brewing worldwide. Eventually, Audrey began to accept that her chances of returning to her days of success and fame were gone. As her willpower and confidence diminished, Audrey began to avoid eye contact with everyone except her mother. She found enjoyment in small pleasures like walking her dogs out in the fields. But even that was taken away from her when she had to surrender her dogs because she could no longer afford to feed them. With nothing else to do, Audrey would pace around her house in agitation. A report from 1926 wrote of Audrey, "Her face bears the marks of heartaches and disappointments, and the figure which won the admiration of the world as it appeared in the works of artists and sculptors of the first rank, in several motion pictures which made record-breaking successes, is worn and wasted with illness and suffering. Some people say that Miss Munson has suffered a complete nervous breakdown, and that her possible comeback to the world of pearls and motor cars becomes more and more impossible every day that she morbidly thinks of the curse brought upon her by her great beauty. Was Audrey haunted by the words of the Romani traveler that spoke to her in her childhood? Did she mutter them under her breath as she walked aimlessly around her house? Did she feel that she had been cursed, that she had never been given a real chance? Was she filled with fear that her worst nightmare had come true? As Audrey's condition worsened, her behavior became more and more erratic. She began to hear voices, sometimes even from the electrical wires in their house. Kitty, who always stood by her daughter's side, was becoming increasingly concerned for her daughter's well-being. On June 8, 1931, Audrey's 40th birthday, Kitty made the heartbreaking decision to commit Audrey to a state hospital for the clinically insane. Audrey was sent to St. Lawrence State Hospital in Ogdensburg, New York, near the border of Canada, where she would remain for the rest of her life. How did Audrey feel that on her 40th birthday, a day that should have been celebratory, her own mother committed her to a state hospital? Did she feel betrayed? Or had she lost so much faith for the world and her ability to live a flourishing life in it that she accepted her mother's decision without a fight? Upon hearing the news that his daughter had been committed, Audrey's father Edward wrote the following poem. Thus a life of wealth, fortune, pomp, and pride was soon cast aside, and she in Ogdensburg does now reside, and her one thought is to commit suicide. This is why I hate to attend a theater, for in the background of the stage, I fancy I see my dear daughter's grave. Kitty was haunted by her decision to commit Audrey, and her guilt became unbearable. But once Audrey was committed, there was no way for Kitty to reverse her decision. In surviving letters to friends, Kitty wrote, "My poor girl is well and fine, but compelled to stay against all I can do. I am past 70 years old and not very well. Of course, I am broken-hearted about my daughter." Doctors even gave Audrey a reassessment after 3 years, but found that she had made no improvements. Luckily, St. Lawrence State Hospital did seem to provide a quality life for its patients. Their staff believed that one of the greatest forms of treatment was to help patients build their self-confidence and self-worth. They had facilities centered on self-care, like a beauty salon, and community-based activities like sewing workshops. They even had a farm where patients helped grow vegetables and milk cows. Audrey took a particular liking for painting. A rare report from a newspaper wrote, "Landscape painting in watercolor is her favorite pastime, and Miss Munson is never happier than when exhibiting her handiwork or relating her experiences in the movies or in the studios of famous artists." But still, in her lucid moments, she draws from her little store of mementos, the photographs that once marked her as the most beautiful woman in the world. Then, with a sigh, returns them, carefully, to the board of her souvenirs of another life, now faded and gone. How did Audrey feel as she looked at these mementos from her past? Did the days she modeled for the greatest artists of her time feel so far away that they were almost dreamlike? Figments of her imagination, a reality so far removed that she could hardly believe it were once real. Did she have any regrets? What did she miss the most? Or did she find a sense of comfort in her austere life at the hospital, away from anyone who could harm her or take advantage of her? Did she find solace in the simple pleasures? As if a symbol of her downfall, in 1935, after Audrey had been at the state hospital for over 4 years and long forgotten by society, the right arm of her most famous statue, Civic Fame, plunged 8 stories down from the top of the municipal building. Like Audrey, her statue had weathered too much wear and tear and was falling apart. As her statue's right arm plummeted to the ground, it was almost as if Audrey herself was screaming, "Look what you've done to me." Audrey remained in the hospital when in 1945, her father died at the age of 88. Audrey's name was not even mentioned in his obituary. And Kitty's death followed in 1958, when Audrey lost not only her mother and dearest friend, but also her only visitor. Luckily, Audrey did build a sense of community at the hospital. Amongst the other patients and staff, Audrey was considered a resident celebrity. The nursing staff were known to give her special treatment and pampering. One nurse described Audrey as having a, quote, royal aura to her. And perhaps Audrey's celebrity status gave her a free pass to flirt with all of the male staff, which she did even into her late age. The nurses that cared for Audrey agreed that Audrey did not seem to suffer from any obvious mental illness. She did not require any medication or specified treatment. As one described Audrey, she was always smiling. She was always pleasant. She was never surly or rude. It does beg the question, was Audrey mentally ill, or was she simply reacting to years of being taken advantage of? To being cast out by Broadway, Hollywood, and even the art world like a pariah? To society's rejection of her at the blink of an eye, and her continued loneliness and inability to find a life partner? If you had endured all that Audrey had, wouldn't you have a breakdown too? Staff also noted that though her hair had turned gray in her late age, her skin remained remarkably smooth and wrinkle-free. This could be credited to Audrey's nighttime routine of rubbing milk on her face before bed, which nurses said she did daily. When Audrey turned the impressive age of 100 years old, she was just as beautiful as she had been in her prime. On her milestone birthday, Audrey was given a giant teddy bear and a small glass of wine. When asked what her birthday wish was, she closed her eyes, smiled, and replied, "To fly a jet plane." Not even old age and over half a century in a state hospital could kill Audrey's adventurous spirit. Audrey survived another 4 years until she died on February 20th, 1996, at the age of 104. Audrey had spent over 60 years of her life at St. Lawrence State Hospital. She was buried in an unmarked grave in the New Haven Cemetery, next to her father. Though she was once the most famous model in America, only the hospital's local newspaper made any mention of her death. It seemed that Audrey had been all but forgotten. Even the St. Lawrence State Hospital, where Audrey spent 6 decades of her life, has since been abandoned, as it remains today. Audrey's records at the state hospital were sealed until 2016, 20 years after her death. Her records show that Audrey was never diagnosed with any specific mental illness, but had symptoms such as depression, hallucinations, and delusion. Psychologists today believe that Audrey most likely had schizophrenia, supported by the fact that Audrey's condition seemed to flare in her mid to late 20s, the age when schizophrenics begin to exhibit signs of the illness. Though Audrey Munson's legacy has been unfairly forgotten by history, she has more recently begun to receive the attention she deserves. In 2000, she was the subject of an exhibition at the Arsenal Gallery in Central Park in honor of Women's History Month. She has been the subject of a few biographies, most notably James Bone's extensive study that pieces together surviving letters, court documents, newspaper clippings, FBI archives, and even interviews with Audrey's remaining relatives. There is a print-out walking tour of all of Audrey's statues around New York City, available online. And artist Andrea Gayer has started a fundraiser to raise money for a gravestone to mark Audrey's grave, declaring that Audrey, quote, not only stood up for her own rights, but also became an activist and organizer, fighting for the recognition of other women. For that and many other achievements, she deserves to be remembered by name. And in perhaps one of the most exciting developments, a single copy of Audrey's second film, Purity, which was previously thought to be lost, was discovered in 1993 in a private French pornographic collection. It has since been screened in public 3 times, once in 1999 at the Pordenone Silent Film Festival, once in 2005 at UC Berkeley, and once in 2015 at the British Museum. But Audrey's greatest legacy is, of course, the countless sculptures that bear her image, not just throughout New York City, but all over the United States. Though her name may have been forgotten, Audrey's image has survived the test of time. She is ingrained into the very heart and soul of New York City, and will always retain the title of Miss Manhattan. As a journalist in 1915 foresaw over a century ago, Audrey Munson, quote, will live in marble and bronze and canvas in the art centers of the world, long, long after she and everyone else of this generation shall have become dust. Author James Bone so eloquently wrote of Audrey, in her sadly curtailed career, Audrey had graced many of the mansions, monuments, and public buildings that defined her era, becoming an emblem of the Gilded Age that disappeared into the Great War and the uncertainty of the 20th century. She broke new barriers in film as America's first naked movie star before the backlash saw censors and movie chiefs clamped down. She helped pioneer new fashions for women and spoke up for a woman's right to control her own body. But her accomplishments were little recognized and quickly forgotten. And to quote another author, Justin D. White, Audrey Munson was a woman who had explored uncharted territory, instilled new concepts, and provoked conventional Victorian ideals. Audrey was an inspiration to the greatest artists of her generation and endeared herself to them like no other. She stepped out of her comfort zone into a new art form known as the silver screen, and for a brief moment captured the American audience with her pose and muse. Like so many women throughout history, Audrey Munson and her immense legacy not only faded far too quickly, but was and continues to be overshadowed by the male artists, filmmakers, theater producers, and Hollywood heads who were just as happy to profit from her image as they were to toss her out like trash. When Audrey is remembered, it is more often for the scandals that plagued her life and for her tragic mental decline. But what is so frequently left out of her story is her groundbreaking stance on not only models' rights, but women at large, her immense creative talent as a model, singer, musician, actress, and performer, her bravery to push past not only her own self-consciousness, but society's scorn, and pose in the nude for sculptures, and later to be the first woman to appear in the nude on film, and for her resilience to continue to chase her dreams after endless tests, rejections, and defeats. Audrey not only advocated for art models' rights, but expanded the parameters that art models were limited to, asserting that art models were artists themselves. In Audrey's own words, an artist model who is intelligent, as all must be if they are to inspire, learns a great deal about art and its uncertainties, its dreams and ideals and its disappointments as she passes from one studio to another in her daily work. From the temperamental painter who is a great man one day and a naughty child the next, to the earnest analytical sculptor who is a cynic about women even as he idealizes them. The model learns art from all its perspectives. And the more she learns, the more she is apt to ask herself, in the privacy of her own room at night after a hard day's work, just what is art after all? And when arguing that in theater, the actor, director, and writer were all equally credited in a play, she pointed out that this wasn't the case in art. As Audrey argued, not so with the artist model. She remains ever anonymous. She is the tool with which the artist works. Though she provides the inspiration for a masterpiece and is the direct cause of enriching the painter or sculptor. Well, today we aim to bring Audrey's vision to fruition and honor her as an artist, creative, and remarkable woman in her own right. Next time you enter the New York Public Library, or walk past the Plaza Hotel, or visit the Brooklyn Museum, or picnic in Columbus Circle, or pass the countless other statues that Audrey modeled for, think of Audrey Munson, of her childhood in upstate New York when she developed an unbreakable bond with her mother, of the prophecy she received that would eerily predict the course of her life, of her beginnings as a chorus girl and move to New York City, of her happen-chance discovery on the streets of New York, of her beginnings as an art model and her quick rise to fame as the most beloved model of the Gilded Age, of the 1915 World Fair, in which Audrey featured in 3/4 of all the statues in the exposition, of her venture to Broadway and the tragic aftermath of the Broadway executive's attempted assault, which bears all too similar a resemblance to the recent Me Too movement, of her groundbreaking films, in which she was the first leading lady in American film history to appear in the nude, of her refusal to give up after her decline in success, of the murder trial that Audrey found herself at the heart of society, and worse, the artists that she dedicated years of her life modeling for, turning their backs on her, of the movie made about her life that ended in a lawsuit, or her quest for the perfect man that ended in heartbreak, of her suicide attempt, continued distress and delusions, and finally her commitment. And even in her decades spent at the state hospital, Audrey made the most of her situation. She learned to enjoy the safety that the hospital brought her, took up painting, treated staff with respect, and even still dreamed of flying a plane on her 100th birthday. And there is no better way to close Audrey's story than with Audrey's words herself. As Audrey wrote in a letter in 1921, "I am wondering if many of my readers have not stood before a masterpiece of lovely sculpture or a remarkable painting of a young girl, her very abandonment of draperies accentuating rather than diminishing her modesty and purity, and ask themselves, where is she now, this model that had been so beautiful? What has been her reward? Is she happy and prosperous, or is she sad and forlorn, her beauty gone, leaving only memories in her wake?" I hope you have enjoyed ArtMuse's 2-part episode on Audrey Munson. I've included images, resources, and suggestions for further reading on the ArtMuse website and Instagram. ArtMuse is produced by Kula Production Company. Today's episode was written by me, your host, Grace Anna. Stay tuned as I continue to share the stories of the women behind some of the world's most important works of art. Until next time, bye for now.
When raising a Pacifico beer with friends you just met turns into hitting up their friend's local art show, getting inspired to create something together, and painting your first mural, you found what was waiting for you. Pacifico. Life's waiting. 21 plus only. Discover responsibly. Pacifico Clara Beer. Imported by Crown Imports, Chicago, Illinois.
Hey parents, Greenlight is here to take one big thing off your to-do list, teaching your kids about money. With a Greenlight debit card and money app of their own, kids and teens learn to earn, save, and invest. You can send money instantly, set flexible controls, and get real-time notifications of your kids' money activity. Set up chores and put allowance on autopilot to reward them for their hard work. Then, learn about the world of money together. Get 1 month free when you sign up at greenlight.com/podcast.
What is art without the muse? Many of Western art's most famous works are depictions of women. But who were these women? Do they have their own stories to share with the world? Hello and welcome to Season 2 of ArtMuse, a podcast that aims to reshape the ways in which we interpret well-known works of art by paying dues to the women whose images have been immortalized, but whose names and stories have been wrongfully overlooked. While these women's faces are familiar to viewers around the world, their identities have been largely forgotten. Each episode will focus our attention on the female muse, sharing their lives and important legacy. Together, we will appreciate these works of art from a new perspective, through the eyes of the women whose image stares back at us. Season 2 continues to share the life stories of the women pictured in famous works of art, this time with the theme of society women and social sensations. Season 2 honors the legacies of 10 different women, plus a secret bonus episode. Season 2 will begin its release this July. We cannot wait to share these amazing women's stories with you. In the meantime, we hope you continue to enjoy Season 1 of ArtMuse, available on all streaming platforms. Until next time, bye for now.